Professional basketball has never moved at a slower pace than it does right now, and for anyone trying to follow the league day to day, the volume of news has become difficult to keep up with. Contracts, injuries, officiating disputes, personal statements from players arrive on an almost daily cycle, and this past week added another layer to that cycle. A public reckoning over what players are enduring online and what, if anything, the league can do about it. The story traces back to a game between the Indiana Fever and the Phoenix Mercury in late June. During that matchup, Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas made contact with her fist to Caitlin Clark's throat. Officials did not call a foul on the play at the time. The league office reviewed the incident afterward and suspended Thomas for 1 game. On the court, the moment lasted only a few seconds. Off the court, it set off a much longer chain of consequences that had little to do with basketball. In the days following her suspension, Thomas said she had received death threats and had been called racial slurs. She described the volume and intensity of the response as far beyond ordinary criticism of a disputed foul call. Her comments were not isolated. They arrived alongside a broader pattern that players, coaches, and league officials have been describing throughout the season. A rise in targeted hostility online that tracks almost exactly with the league's rise in visibility. That visibility is not in question. The WNBA signed a media rights deal worth billions of dollars in recent seasons. Attendance figures have climbed. Player salaries have increased substantially. Games that once aired in near obscurity now draw ratings that rival and at times exceed more established professional leagues. The arrival of Caitlin Clark, along with Angel Reese and other high-profile rookies over the past 2 seasons, accelerated that shift. More cameras, more coverage, and more casual fans have followed, so as a sharp increase in vitriol directed at the athletes themselves. Clark addressed the issue directly at practice on a Friday session in early July. She said she had spoken about it before and would keep saying it. The harassment and hate directed at players is not acceptable, whether it targets an opposing team, her own teammates, or her coaches. She was explicit that no player should have their character questioned in the way that has become common in comment sections and on social media platforms, and she said she does not want anyone to have to go through that kind of treatment. Her comments followed a 2-minute opening statement from Fever head coach Stephanie White earlier in the week. White described a marked increase in toxicity across the league as a whole, citing racism and homophobia specifically as part of what players are now regularly exposed to online. She said she believes most of that hostility is not coming from genuine fans of the WNBA or of the Fever, but from a broader online environment that has attached itself to the league's growing profile. White has a direct connection to this particular flashpoint. She coached Thomas in Connecticut 2 seasons ago and said she witnessed similar vitriol directed at her then. She was pointed in her framing of the trade-off athletes except by playing at this level, acknowledging that competition invites criticism and that fans will always have a complicated relationship with the players and teams they follow. But she drew a clear line between criticism and cruelty, saying it is not difficult to avoid being a source of hatred, and that anyone contributing to that hostility online should not consider themselves a fan of the league at all. WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert issued her own statement shortly after Thomas went public with what she had received, condemning what she called any and all forms of hate directed at players. The league has been building out a response to this problem for several seasons now, well before this particular incident. Security has been increased for teams traveling on the road, and protocols at arenas and hotels have been tightened. Franchises now travel by charter flight rather than commercial carriers, a change that has made logistics easier but was driven in large part by concerns over player safety and exposure in public spaces. The league has also introduced software designed to identify and flag threats, harassment, and hate speech directed at players and teams across social media platforms more quickly than manual review would allow. None of these measures have proven capable of eliminating the problem. Anonymous accounts continue to generate hostility that outpaces any single system built to catch it. This is where the conversation splits, and where the online reaction to Clark's and White's comments has become its own story. A significant portion of the response online has pushed back on the framing that players are simply victims of an unfair system. Critics have argued that public figures, particularly in an entertainment-driven league that has actively courted a larger audience, should expect criticism as a cost of doing business. Some commentary has gone further, suggesting that any player who cannot tolerate negative feedback on a public platform has a simple option available: close the account or stay off the platform entirely. That sentiment has appeared repeatedly in fan discussion. Framed as a matter of personal responsibility rather than a league or cultural failure, there is a distinction worth making here, because it tends to get lost in the broader argument. What Thomas described, and what White and Clark were responding to, was not garden-variety criticism of a foul call or a shooting slump. It was death threats and racial slurs. Disagreement over officiating, coaching decisions, or a player's performance falls within the normal bounds of sports discourse, however heated that discourse can get. Threats against a person's life and targeted racial abuse do not fall into that category, regardless of how the platform or the audience characterizes it. The players and coaches speaking out this week were not asking fans to stop having opinions about basketball. They were describing a different phenomenon entirely, one that intersects with the sport but is not really about it. At the same time, the log-off argument reflects a real and long-standing tension within the sports media ecosystem, one that predates this particular controversy by years. Athletes across every major league have wrestled with the reality that visibility and criticism arrive as a package deal, and that a segment of any fan base will always frame legitimate scrutiny and outright abuse as functionally the same thing when it suits their argument. Some players have adopted the position that engaging with any of it, positive or negative, is a losing proposition and that the healthiest path is disengagement altogether. Others have pushed back publicly, as Clark and White did this week, arguing that silence effectively cedes the platform to the people generating the abuse in the first place, and that speaking out is itself a form of accountability. The debate carries additional weight given the specific trajectory of the WNBA over the past 2 seasons. For most of its history, the league operated with a comparatively narrow, dedicated fan base, largely insulated from the kind of mainstream scrutiny that follows leagues like the NFL or NBA. That insulation has disappeared. Television audiences for marquee matchups now regularly draw millions of viewers. Merchandise sales have surged. Rookies arrived to sold-out arenas in cities that had not sold out a WNBA game in years. That growth has been financially transformative for the league and its players, but it has also imported the less appealing aspects of mainstream sports culture, including a much larger population of anonymous critics with no attachment to the sport beyond a single viral clip or controversial officiating call. Thomas's situation illustrates how quickly that dynamic can escalate. A disputed, unreviewed play during a live broadcast became a suspension within days, and the suspension itself became the trigger for a wave of threats severe enough that the player felt compelled to describe them publicly. White's connection to Thomas from their time together in Connecticut adds another layer, showing that this is not a new phenomenon isolated to one market or one moment, but a pattern the coach has now witnessed play out around the same player twice, in 2 different cities, years apart. Engelbert's statement, while broadly worded, signals that the league office views this as an institutional problem rather than a series of isolated incidents involving individual players. The investment in monitoring software and enhanced security reflects that same institutional posture. This is being treated as a persistent operational challenge, not a public relations issue to be managed with a single statement and then set aside. Whether that institutional response will be enough remains an open question. Automated detection systems can flag content faster than human moderators, but they cannot prevent someone from creating a new anonymous account within minutes of the last one being suspended. Enhanced security at arenas and hotels protects players physically but does nothing to blunt what arrives in their phones after a game. The tools the league has built address the visible symptoms of the problem without resolving the underlying incentive structure that produces it. Conflict, controversy, and outrage drive engagement, and engagement drives the same growth in visibility and revenue that the league has spent years pursuing. That contradiction sits at the center of everything unfolding this week. The WNBA wants the attention that comes with stars like Clark, Reese, and Thomas, drawing casual viewers into games they otherwise would not watch. That attention has produced record broadcast numbers and a landmark media rights deal. It has also produced a volume of hostility directed at the athletes themselves that the league is now scrambling to manage after the fact, rather than having anticipated in advance. Clark, White, and Engelbert's comments this week represent an attempt to draw a public line between the criticism that comes with competing at a high level, which they have all acknowledged is fair, and the targeted threats and slurs that do not belong in that category. Regardless of how loudly some corners of the fan base argue otherwise, the racial component of this controversy has generated its own separate strand of commentary, running alongside the harassment story rather than fully merging with it. Clark's rise to prominence has repeatedly become entangled in discussions of race within the league, given that she is one of the most visible white stars in a league composed primarily of black players. Some commentators have argued over the past 2 seasons that a portion of Clark's popularity is inseparable from her race, drawing criticism from other corners of the media landscape who view that framing as reductive and unsupported by direct evidence. That argument resurfaced again in the aftermath of the Thomas incident, with some commentary defending Thomas's foul as a legitimate basketball play, and others describing the officiating non-call and subsequent suspension as evidence of inconsistent standards applied to Clark specifically. Neither argument has settled anything. If anything, The disagreement itself has become part of the story, feeding into the same online environment that Clark, White, and Engelbert were describing when they spoke about harassment and toxicity. Angel Reese's presence in the league over the same stretch has followed a similar arc, though her specific circumstances differ from Clark's. Reese has been a consistent draw for television audiences since entering the league, and her rivalry with Clark, real or manufactured by media coverage, has become one of the more heavily discussed storylines in women's basketball. That rivalry narrative, whatever its accuracy on the court, has itself become a vehicle for a portion of the hostility both players receive, with some of the ugliest exchanges online framed as fan loyalty to one player over the other rather than commentary on either player's actual performance. The broader ratings and revenue picture helps explain why the league has been unwilling to simply pull back from the attention driving this controversy. Games featuring Clark and Reese have consistently outdrawn the league's historical viewership figures by wide margins, in some cases drawing audiences larger than same-day broadcasts from more established men's professional leagues. That shift has translated directly into the media rights deal signed in recent seasons, one large enough to materially change franchise valuations and player compensation across the league. None of that growth has come without cost. The same visibility that produced record ratings also produced a much larger audience of casual, often anonymous viewers with no long-term investment in the sport. A group significantly more likely to engage with players through outrage, mockery, or targeted abuse than through the kind of sustained fandom that characterized the league's smaller audience in prior decades. League officials have been candid that the security and monitoring investments made over the past several seasons were built specifically to manage that trade-off. The shift to charter travel, more heavily staffed security details on the road, and expanded protocols at hotels and arenas were not framed publicly as reactions to any single event, but as a broader recognition that the players attracting record audiences were also absorbing a level of public exposure the league had not previously had to account for. The automated software introduced to flag threats and hate speech across social platforms represents the newest layer of that response, built to catch and act on abusive content faster than a team of human moderators reviewing reports manually. Even so, officials involved in that effort have acknowledged its limits. Anonymous accounts can be recreated within minutes of being removed, and detection software calibrated to catch explicit threats or slurs does not necessarily catch the steadier, lower-grade hostility that players describe as wearing on them over the course of a season. That distinction between the acute cases like the one Thomas described and the more constant, lower-level negativity many players say they absorb simply by having a public account is part of what has made this week's public comments resonate more broadly across the league than a typical response to a single suspension. White's remarks in particular were framed less as a defense of one player and more as an observation about where the league's culture has drifted as its audience has expanded. Her point that criticism is an accepted part of competing publicly, paired with her insistence that cruelty is a separate and unacceptable category, reflects an attempt to draw a boundary that much of the online conversation around the story has resisted maintaining. None of this is unique to women's basketball, though the speed at which it has arrived is. Athletes across other sports have described similar patterns as their leagues expanded into new media deals and larger audiences, with the same basic sequence repeating itself: growth in visibility, growth in revenue, and a corresponding growth in the volume of abuse directed at the athletes who made that growth possible. What sets the current WNBA moment apart is the compressed timeline. Leagues that grew gradually over decades had more time to build institutional responses before the scale of the problem caught up with them. The WNBA's growth over the past 2 seasons has been so sudden that the league's security, moderation, player support infrastructure has had to be built largely in real time, often in direct response to specific incidents rather than as part of a long-planned strategy. That reactive posture shows up clearly in the timeline of this particular story. The foul, the non-call, and the suspension all happened within the span of about a week. Thomas's public comments about the threats she received came within days of the suspension itself. White's and Clark's statements followed within another few days, and Engelbert's league-wide condemnation came almost immediately after that. Compressed into a single news cycle, the sequence illustrates how quickly a single unreviewed play during a live broadcast can escalate into a supervisory statement from the commissioner's office, with almost no time in between for the initial controversy to fade. Before the next layer of the story took over, fan reaction across social platforms has split along fairly predictable lines since Clark's and White's comments circulated. A portion of the response has been supportive, echoing the players' framing that there is a meaningful difference between disagreeing with a call and sending death threats over one. Another portion has pushed back, arguing that professional athletes at this level of visibility should expect a certain baseline of hostility as a function of the platform they occupy, and that the solution lies with the players adjusting their relationship to social media rather than with the league or its fans changing their behavior. That second position, while framed by its proponents as a matter of personal responsibility, does not typically distinguish between garden-variety criticism and the specific conduct Thomas described. A gap that has kept the two sides of the argument largely talking past each other rather than engaging with the same set of facts. Whether the league's newer initiatives, including the automated monitoring software and the expanded security protocols, will meaningfully reduce the volume of threats directed at players remains to be seen over the back half of the season. Early indications suggest the tools can act faster on flagged content than manual review previously allowed, but faster removal does not address the underlying incentive that produces the content in the first place. As long as controversy, rivalry, and outrage continue to drive engagement and, by extension, revenue, the league faces a structural tension between the attention it has spent years courting and the safety of the players generating that attention. For now, the season continues. Thomas has returned to the court following her one-game suspension. Clark remains one of the most heavily covered athletes in American sports, a position that guarantees continued scrutiny of everything she does, on the court and off it. White will keep coaching a roster that has become the focal point of a league-wide conversation neither she nor her players ask to be at the center of. And the broader argument, over where legitimate criticism ends and targeted abuse begins, shows no sign of resolving itself before the next controversial play forces the question back into the open.